Hi, I'm Vic Bearcroft, and today I'm going to show you how to paint a lovely portrait of our husky Ella in pastel on velour. So we're going to use a combination of hard and soft pastels for this. Soft pastels, I'll explain about those a little bit later. Of course, we don't want them to be too soft. First of all, I'm going to start off with a hard black pastel, and we're going to create a tonal sketch. Now, the tonal sketch essentially is a monochrome underpainting, whereby we get shapes and a little bit of form created by tonal values. So I'm going to start with Ella's ears at the top, and basically treating this like a fairly comprehensive sketch, but nothing highly detailed at this stage. I'm more interested in getting the actual shapes, the most important shapes in. So we've got a little dark edge around the top of the ears. Also, it's important to understand what not to sketch at this stage. Usually that will be anything that requires a fairly strong highlight towards the end. So particularly in this case, we've got some pale fur, of course, some strong highlights maybe on the nose, the forehead and things like that. So I don't want to put a very dark outline around those. Everywhere else, if it's just going to be a medium strength highlight, we can get away with something like that, very faint grey line. And the same around the edge of this ear. And the point is to keep it fairly loose and fairly sketchy at this stage. Don't try and get involved too early with too much detail. So we've got outlines as such, a little bit of a furry edge, and it's important to start off with thinking about the length and direction of the fur, quite thick around her neck, behind the ears, as with any husky. So what I'm doing at this stage is basically creating or starting to create a fur map. And the fur map is essentially showing the length and direction, thickness of the fur at any particular point. So just a few lines really to indicate the length and direction, the thickness. These lines will either represent actual dark fur, or they'll just be shadows within clumps of lighter fur. So we've got a nice dark line coming around here, which is composed of darker fur. So I'm just going to again loosely create that edge. And again down here, just observing from our reference the direction of the fur, which takes a lot of twists and turns around the neck and shoulder. So just be careful at this stage to make note of that. Once you've got those lines in, that fur map, then you can use that as a guide to carry on painting more fur later on. Now naturally the fur is going to get shorter as we get towards the features. So what I'm doing is I usually start around the outside edge and then work in towards the face. And what we have here, very useful for us, is obviously different coloured fur. We've got some pale fur around the face, we've got that little sort of dark grey bonnet along the top, which always gives us some interesting shapes and shapes to work with. Obviously, as I said, the fur is getting much shorter here, so what I'm doing first of all is trying to get the outline of that dark grey fur. We've got a little indentation of the forehead coming down here, so I'll just mark that in. Get the shape of the head. And fur at the base of the ears. a soft outline on the left hand side. We don't want that to be too harsh because we've got some pale fur there. And then this is where fur always takes another interesting turn or two at the base of the ears. So we've got essentially fur going up and around like that, very short fur. I can indicate that with just a few very short textural strokes to start with. And essentially where we want our fur to be darker, in other words where there's more shadow in that very short fur, we just put those marks close together. And that's all it is. Give it a little rub. You see that area will get darker. And as that heads out towards the base of the ears, then we've got a little ridge. Almost a ridge there where that fur from the head meets the fur around the base of the ears. It's like two tides meeting, and that break in the fur, same as a break in the waves I suppose, causes interesting shapes. So we've got a shape going down here, and you see that fur wave or fur tide flows down that way, and then it starts going up towards the base of the ear, and then another break where that meets the fur on the neck. So lots of lovely interesting twists and turns to work with, and this is why it's so important to get our fur map established. And when we look at that, when it's finished, we can see all those twists and turns, we can see the direction of the fur in any particular part and the thickness of it and so on. And then we can work with that if we want to add more fur detail later on. So it's the inside of the ear. And the inside of the other ear, that's fur growing from the inside out over the cavity, the ear hole. So then we've got some really soft pale fur in the face, so we don't want to overdo this, of course. Let's just get a little bit more done in that crease in the forehead. We'll just show the crease in the forehead, that will do. Now at this stage, before we do any of this pale fur, I'm going to give it all a really good rub. So hold your board tight, just give it a firm stroke at the end of your finger, or you can use paper towel if you don't want to get pastel all over your fingertips. What I would do is push that pastel into the fibres of the paper, makes it stick. It's not going to go anywhere, as you can see. The beauty of velour paper means your pastel stays exactly where you put it, so you can actually build up lots and lots of really nice soft layers, especially when it comes to fur. And it softens the edges, softens the tone a little bit, and allows you, then it gives you a good firm bed to put more pastel on. So we've got this pale fur now around the face. It's whitish, never pure white, but whitish. When she was out in the snow recently, you could tell just how white the fur isn't against the snow. Under normal circumstances, normal lighting, it appears to be white. So we've got the shape of the eye just showing on the left hand side there, so we'll give that a little mark. And we'll come back to this eye. Now here, the bridge of her nose coming down there is this white fur. We'll call it white fur. So I don't want to do a outline on that, not in black certainly, because it will be harder to get a highlight on it later on, so I'm going to leave that for now. Instead what I'm going to do is work from the tip of the nose down. So I get the shape of a nostril roughly put in place. Yeah, we can work that out in more detail later on. And the shape of the tip of the nose, going down to the mouth. We've got scent glands here, just above the corner of the nostril, and 1, 2 here. Then we've got whisker follicles. I'm not going to make them too heavy. They're not surrounded by black fur like a tiger, perhaps. But we always have 4 rows of whisker follicles, so there they are. Going down to the mouth. And this is what a lot of people refer to as the husky smile. They always imagine huskies are smiling when their mouth is closed. And it gives you this lovely sort of curved look, which I'm doing, creating not as a single line, by the way, as a furry edge. I've got the fur from the top lip overhanging the bottom lip and the chin. It gives it a little furry edge, and that sort of husky smile that we've got there. The shape of the mouth. So, coming down to the lower jaw and the chin, again a soft edge, because it's in shadow but it's still pale fur, so I don't want to overdo it. So that means holding back on your black pastel, don't press too hard. All these sort of soft muscle anatomical shapes underneath that pale fur has got to be described somehow, so that needs to be done with the lightest of touches. And the same down the throat and into the neck. It's pale fur, but it's in shadow, so the lightest of touch just to get that shape established. I've got fat cheeks. What I mean is muscular cheeks here. They're very powerful muscles around here, upper part of the jaw. A lot of dogs will have, of course, wolves as well, will have those powerful muscles around here. Chomping through bones, other things. Now, the eye that shine, she's got blonde eyelashes, by the way, so white eyelashes, so we've got to allow for those. What I'm going to do is get the shape of the blue eye in first, and the pupil, just dab that in for now, gently. And that's going to leave a little bit of a gap at the top where the row of blonde or white eyelashes can go. So again, just a rough shape of that to start with. And we can make changes later on. And I'm just going to make a little change now just to not make it look so sleepy. And the lower rim. And the inner corner of the eye, where the tear duct begins, down to there. So again, at this point, just a rough shape of the eye will do. And the little ridge of fur there, where the fur from the nose goes up and meets the fur from here, which is below the eye, which is coming down. That's why you'll see these little ridges. So you imagine this fur coming down away from the eye, meeting fur going up from the nose. And around here too, we've got fur going up towards the forehead. All these little ridges or breaks in the fur need to be shown, especially when it's pale fur, when you can see a lot going on. Sometimes with dark fur, if you've got a black dog, you might not see these breaks as much. So nice and soft, like so. The second part, we'll leave our fur texture for now. The second part of this tonal sketch is adding tone. And for that, we're going to use the flat side of our hard black pastel and break this down into 3 tones essentially. The dark grey paper that I'm using is going to be the lightest tone when we finish, and then I'm going to add a light grey to that with the black, and a medium grey also with the black pastel. So we get like 3 tones, which should give us some form at least. So what I'm going to do is treat this very lightly. I'm going to go over the ear, the central part of the ear and the back of the ear as well, with the same light tone. Okay, rub that in. And you can see that's a slightly darker than our paper already, in fact considerably darker than our paper already. And I'm going to use that same tone to go over everything apart from the pale fur, the white fur, which I'm going to leave. That's the first thing. And the second thing will be to add another layer of the same, another light layer, to create slightly darker grey fur. Always rub it in. So each layer you put on, make sure you rub that in really well. Fix the pastel into the paper, soften the edges, soften the tone, and give you a firm bed on which to work for the next layer. And this is always an interesting part because you can soon begin to see the 3-dimensional form, even with just 2 tones. When we get to 3 tones, 3 tones is a minimum for me. You can work on this part for several hours. In fact, you could do a whole monochrome sketch or painting if you wanted to, and just put many different tones in. 3 is a minimum, because with a dark tone, i.e. a shadow tone, a mid-tone and a highlight, then you'll have something that looks 3-dimensional. When I'm doing this around the furs, you can see what I'm doing is using short fur strokes. In other words, I'm still following the length and direction of the particular fur, even though I'm using the flat side of the pastel. That means if you catch the edge of your pastel, then at least it's going in the right direction. So you don't want to be going horizontally or vertically. Just keep following the shape of the fur and the underlying anatomy. So we've got a soft shadow under there. Again, that's going to be our light tone. You can see already where we have the fur sketched underneath and we put a light tone over the top, it automatically becomes a little bit darker anyway. Let's shade around this muscle in the cheek. Again, the same light tone. If you're not sure about your tonal values, always start with a lighter tone than you think you're going to need, because it's so easy to add more tone and indeed more colour when we get to the colour on velour than it is to take it off. Once it's on and rubbed into the fibres, it's very difficult to get off, which is a good thing, because it means you don't have to use fixative or anything like that. Pastel will stay put. You can do many layers in the style of glazing, like an oil painting. But if you make it too heavy, you have to do a lot of rubbing with a kneadable eraser or paper towel to try and just get that tone light enough to continue working. So if in doubt, make it light and then add more. So as light a hand pressure as you can get. So I'm putting all these little soft shadows in. I'm going to just go over the eye itself as well. All these little soft shadows around our pale fur, just leaving, as much as possible, leaving the highlights where the light is shining on the pale fur. And this being short fur around the muzzle, then we don't need to do fur strokes. We can create that with the texture of the velour paper. That's what it's good for, creating short fur texture. So the nose pad and the nostril and around the whisker follicles, around the mouth and the chin. And of course these are helping to create underlying anatomical form where you've got muscle, bone, teeth, whatever it is. So that's our first layer. All I need to do then is add another layer to get, I'll start with the ears again, to get the darker grey tone in. So we're going to have 3 tones. So around the edge of the ear. If you have trouble seeing the tones in a coloured reference, by the way, the easiest thing you can do is just take that coloured reference, take the colour out of it in whatever software you have, and print it out in monochrome or grayscale, and then you'll be able to see the tones easier when you come to do this part. And obviously you can refer to your coloured reference when you come to do the coloured part of the set. So remember, short first strokes, rather than just trying to paint big swathes of grey tone over the whole lot. If you catch the edge of the pastel, which inevitably you will do, we all do, then at least it's making a mark going in the appropriate direction. So I can still see our fur texture underneath. If you press on too hard and make too thick a mark or make it too black, then you'll lose sight of your fur map. So always build up light layers. Don't try to rush it. Nothing to be gained by rushing. And we're going to let this fade out into the bottom right hand corner. She's wearing a harness on the original photograph, but I'm not going to put that in, just going to let it fade out here. So the last bit is, I'll make the eye rim a little bit thicker. We'll come back to the eyes later on anyway to finish them off, or the eye, the one and only we can see. So a little bit darker in the nostril and the nose pad generally. And then the front of the muzzle. Okay, so there's our tonal sketch complete. A little bit of fur texture, not overdoing it. You can spend hours and hours doing almost every single hair, and if you want to, of course, you can. But for this one, we're just going to pretty much leave it like that. We'll put some more fur, actual fur lines in later on, but let's deal with the coloured part. So this is our initial foundation. This is where we get shape and form. We've got the fur texture in the form of a map, we've got the ear shapes, we've got the shape of the muzzle, the eye and so on, and we've got some form showing underlying anatomy with our tones. Now we've got to do another foundation to take it to up to a coloured painting, and this involves using softer pastels. So these are soft pastels, some round, some square, depends on the manufacturer. Basically, as a guide, the cheaper the pastel, the harder they'll be. They have more binder than pigment. And those type of pastels suit Velour better because it's like dirt in a carpet. It sticks better than, for example, extremely soft pastels, which are like talcum powder, which will just stick to the surface of the Velour and maybe fall off. So I'm going to use 3 colours for this. First colour I'm going to use is this lovely sort of ice blue. This is pale ultramarine or sky blue or something along those lines, which is going to be the blue in her eye, also a little bit of blue in the background. So we can bring some colour in the background that we have in her eye as well. Now what I'm going to do is do a fairly flat background, maybe just a little bit of texture, and the way I like to do that is little squares. So if I do this, maybe 1-inch squares in this case, going in different directions, kind of an open texture to begin with. As you can see, I'm not trying to roller paint it or anything like that. What I'm going to do then is give it a good rub, round and round, circular motions, and again you can use paper towel for this. And what you'll start to get bit by bit is a little bit of subtle natural texture. It's almost like the bokeh effect of a camera, you know, where you get the subject in focus and the background sort of blurred foliage or blurred sky, whatever it is. Okay, so this will give you that kind of bokeh blurred mottled background just by concentrating on doing little squares. Again, not too heavy. Grab your board, rub it round and round, and don't forget we want the background to be behind our subject, so it's always best to bring that background colour, in this case the blue, into the edge of your subject, so you avoid getting a grey line all the way around it, which will happen if you try to get too close or just right up to the edge of your subject. Then you'll likely end up with a grey outline all the way around. I do remember when this photograph was taken, she was at the coast, so we had a nice blue sky. Well, she was by water anyway, nice blue sky, and a little bit of water as well. So we can create that sort of horizontal water effect by changing our stroke. And again, I'm going into the edge. So we're going to highlight on top of this blue easily. It's only when you paint a thick black line around the bridge of the nose, for example, you find it harder to get a highlight on it. So I'm going to leave a little bit of the grey paper showing through here and there, and that's going to give us some sort of horizontal water texture, if you like. And as always, sit back and squint, blur out the details and squint at it and see what kind of tones you've got and whether you need to add any more colour or not. I might just add a little bit more colour in the top, so it's a little bit more solid, especially in the corners and the top bit, and then it can fade out underneath. And you can do whatever kind of background you want, of course. Again, round and round when you want a natural sort of blurred background, otherwise follow the texture you're trying to get. So we want horizontal texture here, so horizontal rubbing of the pastel. So that's essentially our background, and I'm going to leave the background fairly indistinct for this one, so it will strengthen the portrait. While I've got the blue, I might as well just put that in the eye as well. Go over the pupils here. A little bit of the grey shows through again. Look at this, she's got very cool pale blue eyes. And we can always add some more colour later if we want to. I'm using two other colours for this, so again soft pastels, or the harder of the soft pastels. One is a raw sienna, it's kind of a yellowish earthy brown. I'll just make a mark on here to show you that. That will represent, for example, a shadow part of the inside of the ears, something like that. Also, some of the more, almost quite tan pale fur that Ella has, and these other huskies have, and some wolves, grey wolves will have it as well. It's a a great colour for creating that tan, pale tan fur. Use the pastel on the side, and what I always advise is to pick an area. Okay, it's not just that little tight section within the ear I'm trying to portray, it's that area generally, or maybe on the reference you'll see that this little bit is sort of yellowish brown or this tan, pale tan colour. Just go for the whole area like that. Okay, it's called blocking in. So blocking in your base colours, literally blocking in an area, and we can tighten it up later on. So we'll have a little bit down here, again mostly in the shadows of the pale fur. Underneath her chin, coming down into the neck. When you start to look for a particular colour, you start to see it everywhere. What I tend to do is pick no more than 3 base colours for this stage, for the foundation stage. It keeps it simple, keeps it uncomplicated. Also, it makes you look for simple colours. Remember, this is a foundation, so these colours need to be potentially quite vivid, quite strong, but also quite simple. They need, more than anything, strength to hold up possibly layers and layers of detail for over the top. So a little bit in the forehead too. And then we'll switch to our darker brown. So we've got a dark brown here. And this one's Van Dyke brown, because she does have little shades of darker brown here and there. In particular, at the moment she has some brown pigment in the nose. This is the snow nose. And around there, not over all of it, but we will darken the rest of it later on. But it's as well just to put a little bit more brown in than you think you're going to need, and we'll get rid of some of it later by painting over the top. So the same around the front of the muzzle, a little bit around the mouth too. Remember, these are background colours, they're not necessarily going to show as strong as they do now. A little bit around the eye, and just a shadow part of the eye on the other side. And then we do have some darkish brown, what appears to be dark brown on the reference. Dark brown in the grey, that's what I'm trying to say. Almost brown tone to that grey fur underlying, that's what we're going to put in. But again, if you can see it, put a little bit of colour in, underlying colour. Doesn't matter if it's not actually there, you know, if it's not exactly the same shade as it is in real life, it doesn't matter. It gives a warm depth to something like what could otherwise be very flat grey fur. So don't be afraid of colour. It will actually make the grey look even greyer. So a little check over, we've got a little bit more just under that cheek muscle there. A very short fur, so a flat part of the pastel will be ideal for that. A little bit of shadow over here. So at this point, your colour over your initial tonal sketch might appear to be quite vivid, quite strong, but don't worry about it, because then after that we can start to bring it back again with our black pastel and white pastel. So it's always a good time to just observe what you've got at this stage, remember it, and then think, okay, that's what the foundation looks like, now let's start building on it. That's the last thing I'm going to do, by the way, is put a little bit of blue in there, which I can see a hint of blue shadow in the nose and around the muzzle. And again, that's useful for helping to pick out the blues everywhere else. Okay, so we have our second foundation done, which is adding our base colours. Quite strong, stronger than you might imagine when you look at the reference. But then we're going to start to knock them back a little bit now by going into our detail stage. So in the detail stage we can be adding more fur texture, as many layers of fur texture as you want. Having velour paper will take a lot of layers. Adding detail to the eye, nose and mouth and so on. So we'll start with the ears. Now Husky's ears are very velvety around the tips, very short fur, and Eleanor is no exception to this. So they're going to be rendered with the flat part of the pastel. I've got a little sort of angle created on the edge of that pastel that gives me a sort of 1/4 of an inch soft brush. So that is going to be used to create, or to finish the fur around the tip of the ears, and indeed around the edge of the ears as well. And the velour paper is going to be our texture. And velour is very, very good at suggesting these short fur textures, like the fur texture on a horse's nose or something like that. And that lovely short fur texture we've got around the tips of the ears is very useful for that. So we only need to do those short fur areas with a flat part of the pastel, gently still, okay? Still approach it gently, we don't want any heavy marks on there. So always remember, apply your pastel gently and rub it in really hard as you can. So I'm going to go anywhere, so just make your edges nice and soft and make your marks a little bit softer, the tones softer and so on. Nice little sort of shape at the top of the ears there, the tips just tip over a little bit. I'm not going to cover the whole of these areas with the black pastel. I can see little hints of paler grey showing through, so that's what I'm trying to do here, is to allow some of those little paler shapes to show through, paler shades to show through. Then just go back and redo any bits that I want a little bit of a darker tone. There we are. Then gradually turning that to a rounded corner, and the pastel just to create a little bit more fur texture. And so I'm not going to do layers and layers of fur texture on this, but you can. What I always suggest is go from dark to medium to light when you're doing the fur texture. So this is our dark. The medium tone, the first layer that you do, this is our first layer, should be enough with the colour we've got underneath, our base colour. If when you do more layers of fur you need to add a little bit more colour, and reintroduce some of this colour again in between subsequent layers of dark and light fur. And you can do that as many times as you like, as long as you use the right pastels and rub them in really well. Again, tracing our original steps from the tonal sketch, and just about see our original fur mat under the base colours, and you can begin to see now, just by adding a little bit of fur texture over these base colours, how they become more subdued, just provide subtle hints of colour in the fur, and that's what they're all about. So you can either, at this stage, you can either paint precise individual sharp hairs with a sharp corner of your hard pastel, or you can simply treat it like a painting, like an oil painting or something like that, using a slightly bigger brush and just go for shape and a little bit of subtle texture. Remember, in a painting you don't have to make it look exactly the same as the photograph. It doesn't have to be sharp detail all the way through. Sometimes if you concentrate your sharp detail into the face, the features, and around that sort of begin to let it get a little bit softer, a little bit more blurred if you like, it will actually add strength to your painting and add more depth. It'll focus the attention on the features, which is what people want to look at anyway. But if you want to add to that and have lots and lots of individual hairs as well, layer after layer, then you can go for that too. So what I'm doing is, around here is just reintroducing some. I can already see some hair from the fur mat. I'm just putting another layer over the top of that and over the top of coloured layer, which more often than not will show enough texture. And another little tip: when you're painting fur, paint from the roots to the tips, and this is especially true if you're painting a lot of layers. Roots to tips, and then a good firm stroke at the roots, and lift your finger off to leave the shaft of the hair and the tips of the hair a little bit more or a little bit less rubbed, should I say. So like that, a stroke and lift. Okay, that way, bit by bit, through the layers, you'll bury the roots. You don't want to see the roots of the hairs. You won't see them on the animal anyway. So you don't want to see them on the painting either. This is a little darker section. Remember, where a section is darker, it's not necessarily darker fur. It could be the same fur in shadow. This actually is slightly darker fur on Ella, but it's also in shadow. In that case, just put your marks close together. I'm not pressing on any harder to get that, or increase the amount of layers. If you suddenly decide to increase the pressure and make those marks darker, then you'll find they're too intense. They will stand out too much. What you want to do instead is either do another layer on top of that, and or put your marks closer together with the same pressure. This is the same pressure doing that as it is doing that. Just there, those marks are further apart, these are closer together, and you'll get that same rub. So coming gradually towards the face, where we can then detail the eye, nose and mouth before we add our final highlights. And try to resist putting any highlights in too early as well. A lot of people can't help it. Seem to want to put some highlights in even before they've barely started the painting. Now, what that will do, it might give you a sort of temporary gratification to see where those highlights are going, but it will contaminate the layers that you put on top of that, and they will stand out. Those areas where you have a white highlight in the fur, for example, and you put some colour over the top and then start to detail it in this way, where if you put the white highlights down too soon in that fur, then they'll start to show up and they'll look odd. So that's the first thing. The second reason is that if you put the highlights on in the appropriate place towards the end, they'll be fresher. Okay, they're not going to get muddied up. You can imagine if I've got some highlights in here now, my hand's resting on the paper, which is allowed to happen on Velour. You can do that. But also, it's going to muddy the highlights. It'll again contaminate them, so there's no point in doing them. I've got to do them again. And the third reason is, I think when you put the highlights on at the end, it's one of those magic moments where the whole thing comes together, and it's a moment of intense satisfaction, I think. A shorter fur around the head, very, very short, tight fur here, short strokes. And good fur stroke with the finger. As always, leaning back now and again to squint, to check the tones. It's all very easy when you're sat on top of something for a length of time for your brain to stop seeing the overall, if you like, the overall big picture. It will see the area you're working on close up, and then you'll miss the overall tones. If you lean back and squint at it, your brain then can't see the detail, you're blurring out the detail, and then you're looking at the tonal values of the whole painting instead. So try and do that every few minutes. That's okay. I'm going to give a nice bit of rub around the edges here to soften that fur. I'm going to go down to the nose next and just reintroduce some detail around here, like scent glands and nostril. Now the dark nostril shape goes in first. And then some shading around that. Snow nose, as I mentioned earlier on, so that's the pigmentation that huskies and a lot of huskies and some other dogs as well will get during the winter, which brings out a little bit of brown, sometimes pink pigmentation in an otherwise black nose. So she's got a snow nose at the moment. It's usually, in her case, a little stripe down the middle, brown stripe down there, so that's what we've created. And again, we'll softly put a few of these whisker follicles back in, not too strong. A bit more shading at the front of the muzzle there, lean back and squint, and a little suggestion of a furry edge around the mouth. Okay, so now we'll go back to the eye. First of all, we'll just put a little hint of the shape of the eye on, there we go, on the left hand side. We can't see the eye, you just see it there, maybe just a slight bit of curve there and a touch of the eyelashes. That's about all, which is that. Now this one, of course, we can see it all. So what I'm going to do is get the pupil in. She's got quite an alert look on this reference, so that's what I'm going to try and go for. Get the pupil in first. And we've got to be careful not to make the eyelashes too low down, otherwise that will close the eye off a little bit more. I want the eye to be fairly open, so that pupil goes up there, then the edge of the coloured part, the edge of the iris. Using a sharper corner of the pastel for this to get a nice sharp edge. And we'll keep checking the curve into the corner of the eye, into our tear duct, a little pointed curve like that. and the soft edge around the rim. Dark rims, but then the soft furry edge around the dark rim. So the upper part of the eye is the same dark rim with the white eyelashes hanging off the eyelid. Again, curve so important. So keep checking the curve. And if you find it difficult using the corner of a hard square shaped pastel like this, by all means you can try using a pastel pencil. They're a little bit harder than these, so they might tend to skid over your velour paper a little bit. But some people say they have reasonable success with pastel pencils on velour. Okay, so I think I'm happy with their expression. A little bit sharp around the nostril there. And then we're ready for our final highlights. So, final highlights are going to be in two stages. First stage, I'm using a hard white pastel. First stage is going to be secondary highlights, which are going to be the sort of soft highlights in the fur and so on. And the second stage will be our primary highlights, which will be the light shining on the edge of the nose and reflection in the eye, things like that. So first of all, what I need to do is make sure I'm using this is a used pastel, make sure I'm using a rounded part of the pastel, and a rounded part of my pastel will give me a softer mark on a hard white pastel. So for example, I could do some soft highlights in the back of the ear. That's the one away from us, and that will separate that ear from the ear closest to us. It's just very soft fur texture. Maybe use that to softly do some hair growing inside the ears from the inside edge, like so. And same on this one. Don't press too hard. You don't need to put any pressure on this white pastel. It's like the black pastel. They're very, very strong in tone. So minimum pressure is required. You can always add more layers. And again, rounded corner just to hint at some paler flecks in that grey fur. So we have dark hairs, grey hairs, pale hairs, and they all form that sort of almost grizzled looking texture. Again, follow the fur map you started with. There can be thicker strokes like this, or there can be very fine strokes, but just follow the length and direction of the fur. You can't go wrong really. So I'm keeping a lot of this fairly soft by using slightly thicker strokes. In other words, a much more rounded corner. Here and there, where we've got the shorter fur, maybe around here, we can use a slightly sharper corner. But remember, what I'm trying to do is keep the focus around this area, not so much around here, so we can whiz through the kind of non-essential area, if you like, of the painting. The neck, behind the ears, by just putting soft marks instead of sharp marks. And if it helps, squint at your reference as well, and that will show you areas where you've got softer marks, almost soft clumps of fur, blurred, out of focus clumps of fur. But it still looks like fur, so that's the main thing. And always a good firm stroke from the roots as before. Do little sections at a time. Stroke from the roots. And you can begin to see at this stage why, it's always a good thing to leave the highlights till the end. Very satisfying to see, even with just one fur texture layer, dark, medium and light tones, very satisfying to see how it all comes together when you put the highlights on. And some people ask how many layers will I recommend to get a decent looking fur. It depends. Depends on how much you do at each layer. I could spend a couple of hours on this particular layer and it would look much deeper and richer fur than it does now. Or I could do this and then I could add another layer on top of that using the black, maybe a little bit of colour and the white again, and again you get the same thing. You get much richer, deeper looking fur, more photorealistic, dare I say. Or you could just do lots and lots of individual, very fine, sharp hairs with the corner of your hard pastel with a sharpened pastel pencil or something like that, layer after layer after layer. There's really no stopping you. You decide when you've had enough. So all I will say is that a painting, and this is a painting after all, a painting shouldn't have to rely on fine detail. Painting tends to rely more on what else you've got. Lighting, atmosphere, colour, tone, all that sort of thing. So as long as you have those, then you can put as much fur in as you like. There's here and there, I've got some of these stronger flecks getting towards the face. I'm using a slightly sharper corner to get some sharper flecks of fur in there with the white. And what will happen is stronger tones, sharper detail will always be seen first. So you can use that to draw attention to the areas that you want people to look at first. If you've got stronger tones and sharper detail around the face, that's where people will tend to look first. That's where the eye is automatically drawn to first. So I'll just turn the pastel around now to get a slightly sharper corner again. Now we're coming into the white fur. White unless you're standing in snow. So now we can do some stronger highlights over the sort of soft tawny grey colour that we have, sort of tanned grey colour we have already. But what I would say is don't swamp it with white at this stage. It won't look too garish, even if you think that fur is very white. Even if it looks very white, don't swamp it with white. Keep it a little bit more subdued. But what we can do to make that even more appropriate, to have these sort of coloured shadows, if you like, is to have the light coming from slightly behind. So if we have the light coming from slightly behind, it will justify us keeping a lot of this in shadow, and we can have a sort of backlighting effect, which always works very well, I reckon, in a painting. Gives it much more atmosphere. We can't see an obvious backlighting in the reference photograph, but we can make one. So I'm not going to do too much white around this side. This will be our shadow side. Let's put some soft highlights in here and there. Remember, as the fur gets shorter, is getting shorter around the face, we don't need to do lots and lots of individual strokes. We can keep those strokes fairly flat and let the paper create the texture for us. And these are still only secondary highlights, so they don't want to be too strong. again, if it helps, squinting your reference to see where you're getting these highlighted bits. I want the edge of the white fur just to bleed into the edge of the pale fur a little bit. The grey fur, I should say. So always make sure the two meet or dissolve into each other, even if it's just adding a few little light hairs like so. And again, make sure, because these pale hairs now, this white pastel now is becoming very visible, make sure you follow the length and direction more so of the hair that you're painting, or the fur that you're painting. So let's do a little bit more secondary highlights around the muzzle, using the flat of the pastel this time, because we do have very, very short fur on the muzzle. So we'll let some of these blue and brown tones show through. So these highlights on here, these secondary highlights, usually account for things underneath, like teeth and muscle pushing the way outwards, which gives you a highlight. And anything that's away from us will cast a shadow. So that's what you're doing, you're creating anatomical form with light and shade. Okay, so that's pretty much our secondary highlights done. We'll just have a little bit of fur in between those whisker follicles, and then we can get on to our final primary highlights, which are going to bring a whole lot together, and fingers crossed it will create a lovely atmospheric painting. Hopefully more atmospheric than even the original photograph. So final highlights. We're going to have a little bit of a backlighting, and this is going to vary depending on what it is you're actually highlighting. So going around the edge of the ears. Now the ears are very soft. Remember, our light is coming from maybe top left, slightly behind. So a lot of this isn't going to be visible on your original photograph. You're just going to have to make it up, really. You decide where the light is going to catch. So it's going to catch the edge of the ear, like so, maybe the back of the ear there, a little touch, maybe the back of the ear there, a little touch. And then around here. So sometimes it'll be a soft mark, sometimes it will be a slightly harder mark. If you're following me on this, then you should be okay. Down to the base of the ear. And down the head. So this is going to be grey coming into pale fur, so not too much on the grey fur for our highlight and our backlighting, a little bit more when we get down to the white fur. There, just above the eye. Short strokes. Make sure you keep them fairly close together, especially when you're highlighting white fur. Those strokes need to be touching. If you get any gaps, it looks like there are gaps in the fur, which they're not, obviously. We'll have a little bit of a spill over onto the eyebrow here. Around the edge of the eye, we can just about make out a couple of blonde eyelashes there, maybe a little touch of reflection on the eye, down below the eye, and then I'll come to this bit. This is the important bit, the bridge of the nose. So first of all, what we'll do is do a line to get the shape. So the shape of the nose down to the tip, something like that, okay? But we can't just leave it like that. What we'll need to do is make sure that nose looks rounded, three-dimensional. So we've got to have some light spilling over. That's the same as if you drew a sphere to represent a ball, and then you did a curved line all the way around, a thin curved line all the way around, and tried to pass that off as a highlight for a sphere. It wouldn't work. Light will spill over a curved object, and light will spill over a curved nose like this as well. So start off with the edge, get the edge sorted out, and then bring a little bit back here and there. You can get clues from your reference on this particular one. And again, different from the reference, what we need to do is that lighting is coming from behind, will shine around the edge of the nose, and indeed down into the mouth and chin. Short fair, of course, down here. Maybe I should use a rounded corner, a little bit more rounded, that's it, better. Soften it a little bit. And finally down into the throat and the neck. So again, pale first, so we can have a little bit of light shining through that from behind. Again, you can't see this on the reference, because it doesn't exist on the reference, but we can add it. And I'll just have a little bit more separation of mouth and neck. Lean back, have a little squint. Quick tidy up of our shiny highlight around the tip of the nose, and then we can finish off by doing the eye. So the eye, I've got some white eyelashes, we'll put those in now, not too strong, I don't want to overpower everything else with the eyelashes, so just a few like so. Then we have a highlight on the iris where the light's shining through the curved clear part of the eye. Light's coming from this side, so we'll have a soft highlight, in other words a pale blue, just at the bottom, slightly towards the right of the eye. This is a pale blue, and if we want we can create a little reflection. Now the reflection usually, pop a little bit in there first, the reflection usually is the light shining on the eye, but if our light is slightly behind, we'll have to justify it some other way. So my justification is the light's probably shining back off maybe a pool of water down here and shining back. In other words, bouncing back off shining water down the right hand side, coming back up again, and maybe creating a little reflection on this side where the light's coming from. Just gives a little shine, a little bit of light to the eye. Doesn't exist on the original reference, but we can make it so. So once you've done that, this one is declared finished. You of course can add many more layers to yours if you want to, and add more to your background. Hope you've enjoyed it. Don't forget, if you're new to YouTube, please subscribe to my channel for more like this, and don't forget to follow the instructions to order your work at home kit and have a go at Ella yourself. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you again next time.